Alpine Liquid Fertilizers is your full-season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. Visit alpinepfl.com for more.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
Hi, I'm your host, Amber Bell, and this is Ruminating with RealAg. I'm really excited for today's episode. We're going to be talking about feedlot manure and using that on cropping systems and what that can look like, including the economics behind it. So to join me on today's episode, we have Ezra Aberle and Mary Keena, and both of them are with the NDSU Carrington Research Extension Center based in North Dakota. So they've been working on research trials surrounding exactly that, on what it's like to compost feedlot manure, what the benefits are, what maybe some of the drawbacks might be, and how producers can make use of what would otherwise be a waste product. So welcome, Mary and Ezra. It's fantastic to have you on this episode.
Thanks so much for having us.
We're going to be talking about composting feedlot waste and manure, and then how that might fit into a cropping system, how producers can use it. So tell me a little bit about your guys' background, your research, and what you guys have been working on in this field.
So I'll go first as the producer of compost. I'll start out. So I'm the livestock environmental management for NDSU Extension. And so long story short, I work with manure and dead animals. And so I go around the state and then across the region and answer questions on we have this manure. What do we do with it? How do we process it? How do we use it? What are the different forms we can use it in? And then all of that is based around water quality. And so how can we make sure that we're doing this in a way that we're either improving or not harming water quality? And so at the center here in Carrington, then we have a cow-calf operation as well as a cropping operation, so an agronomy side of things. And so we get to go full circle with this. And so our cow-calf operation, we calve stuff out. We have a feedlot as well where we background and finish animals. And so we have a lot of manure, and I get to do all kinds of demonstrations with that manure. And so we spread stuff here, like the actual product that we make here, we spread. And so whether that's raw manure, so we stockpile the manure and then we just go spread it on the fields, or if we're using composted manure. And so in composting, we're truly composting it. So we are windrowing it, we're turning it with a turner, we are watering it if it needs moisture, we're temping it, we're timing that. And then when the compost is done, we're either, again, that whole time that's used as a demonstration. So folks can come in, they can see how the process works, what that looks like. We can do different types. We can have too much moisture, not enough, too much nitrogen, not enough carbon, and what that looks like. But then at the end, when we have a real good, complete compost, then I can hand it over to Ezra and he uses it on our cropping side of things.
Oh,
Yeah, so I'll take the compost that's made down at the livestock unit and I use it in our long-term cropping system study. So, and we apply it at a 200 pounds of N once every 4 years in this trial. And it goes on no-till, minimum till, conventional tilled plots. And then we have 3 different crop rotations that are all 4 years. And that's why it's done once every 4 years. It's at the beginning of each cycle. And our weather is just like Canada. It's too variable here. So every crop in the rotation occurs each year. So at 200 pounds, it kind of matches a 50-pound urea application every year. And it was kind of looked to see how does it equate to the 50 pounds urea each year? And we know it's not quite like that. The first year we're probably getting somewhere around 30-ish pounds the first year, and then next year we might be 70 or 80 depending on the weather, and then we drop down again, and then that 4th year we run out of gas. There's probably only about 15-20 pounds left. So that's what we found on the nitrogen side of things.
that's fascinating. And what crops are you growing? What are those 3 crops?
So we've got 3 different rotations right now. We've got spring wheat, sunflower, barley, soybean, and then the second one is spring wheat, field pea, corn, soybean. And then our last one is spring wheat, corn, and soybean.
That's fascinating. I have so many questions.
We had
right off the bat here.
We had canola in previous iterations of this, but we're kind of on the southern limit for decent spring canola. So there's not really a big point in doing it when I'm just breaking even. So
Right.
we switched out to something that we could make money at.
Here in Alberta, there's a lot of canola and a lot of
Yes.
wheat. We get
Yes.
a lot of it. And then, so Mary, can you talk a little bit about the differences that you guys have been seeing? For one, how long has the study been running? And then what have been some of the differences in composting versus just straight manure? And has that economically made sense to compost? A lot of questions in
So
one there.
yeah. Um, so I'm gonna actually let Ezra take this from like what we've seen on the research side of things. But I will tell you from just like a producer and working with producer side of things, um, composting it's like a dedication. Okay, and I'm gonna say this a few times, and maybe Ezra will too. It's a tool in the box. And so, and I tell that with all of it. Manure is a tool in the box, commercial fertilizer is a tool in the box, composting is a tool in the box. And we can use all of them, or we can use some of them sometimes. And so it really depends on the goals of each operation. And so, do you have a turner? Are you willing to invest money in that? And if you are going to invest the money in it, are you going to use it? And so there has to be some dedication behind it because this equipment is expensive. You can make compost without the turner, but it's definitely not the same product in the end. And so, and then what are your goals with that? Are you making compost because you're looking for something that's weed-free, pathogen-free, parasite-free? We've broke it down. We have a reduced surface area. We have more of a homogeneous type product that will more closely mimic a commercial fertilizer when we're actually like reaching our hand in and sampling it. Or is your goal to clear the lots and get some nutrients out there because you need to bring the next round of cattle in? So what's your goal? And again, here at Carrington, we use both. We spread raw manure on our seed stocks fields, and then the compost is used for research. And so, economically, it's a really hard question to answer. I know I just like went around the outside of that, but it's a question that each producer has to answer for themselves. And so, Ezra, from a research side of things, what have we seen in our research?
So we've seen an increase in organic matter on the plots that receive the composted manure. So we also have increase in phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc, and all the micros. And we're able to maintain a 7.1 pH with that, whereas with the commercial fertilizers, especially if we're no-till, we're starting to see a lot of acidification at the surface. So we can maybe mitigate that a tiny bit with composted manure. Other things that we've seen, we've had, we've seen similar yields, equal yields to the 50-pound urea rate, and a lot of times we are achieving the same yields as the 100-pound urea rate.
And that's with how many pounds of compost?
So when I'm spreading that 200 pounds once every 4 years, it kind of depends a little bit on the diet. So the diets are fairly similar. A lot of times it has to do with the moisture content of the compost that I receive. So for that 200 pounds, for me, it's roughly, I think the lowest rate I've ever spread is 18 tons an acre, and the highest has been 24 tons an acre, which I have to go perpendicular to the tillage, and I have to go fast to get that light of a rate on. So I'm a fairly tall guy, so I hit my head on the ceiling in the tractor at least a few times each time I do it.
You guys didn't smooth out the fields first? Come on. So, and then how does that differ to the manure? Are you guys seeing the same effects with manure, or are you seeing that there's definitely a benefit to having the compost?
Well, like Mary said earlier, I mean, the compost is a very homogeneous product that you can spread very
Easily.
uniformly. Whereas, if you're just doing the fresh manure coming out of the lot, you might get chunks in one area, not chunks in the other, straw in this area, more bedding in that area. So it's not as uniform of an application. However, there are certain nutrients that are more readily available in fresh manure than composted manure.
Okay, that makes sense. And then when you guys talk about, because I've looked a little bit into composting, and I have a
Mhm.
friend here at the Westlock Dump who he has a composting facility there that's used on cropland. And it's pretty intense from what I understand. Like the management, you were talking about that, Mary, about how much it takes. Like you've got to be committed. So what exactly does that look like? What does that commitment look like?
So it looks like site selection is the first thing that we talk about every single time. And so that becomes especially important when you're like, well, I'll just use that, piece of ground over there that we don't really do anything else with. And then you go and windrow your compost and then it's flooded. And then you can't actually use it, right? You can't turn it. Or you go into an area and you're like, oh, I can get in there with the tractor anytime, but you didn't leave yourself enough room. Okay. And so site selection becomes important. Those are the practical reasons it's important. We also have to look at the environmental reasons. So how close are we to groundwater? How close are we to surface water? What's our runoff? Do we have any kind of vegetative filter strip there to make sure that we're not losing any kind of nutrients? And so management of that is the first thing. It's best and easiest if you can find ground that has a clay liner that you don't have to worry about moving your site every year, but there's regulations that come into play there as well. And so, and every state is different, and I'm guessing that our countries are different as far as what the regulations are. And so when we even go across state lines, we have to have discussions on you have to do what your state says are the rules. So here in North Dakota, we can have a stacking area, manure stacking area, for 9 months at a time. So the edge of field storage typically is what that is, but sometimes people will use that for compost as well. So 9 months, and then it has to be moved. And we can compost in 9 months. But then the next year we come back because it's not a permanent site, we have to go somewhere else for a year. And that's the same thing with edge of field storage. So if you're going to haul manure out in the spring, but you're not going to apply it until after harvest, we call that edge of field storage. And so we put it there, but then the next year we're going to a different field because we already stored there for 9 months. And then there's permanent stockpiling areas as well, or stacking areas. And that would be where you're actually leaving it there. You've gone through some regulatory oversight. You know that we're not going to have any leaching happening, any groundwater issues, surface water issues, and so we can compost there all the time. And so that is one of the bigger hurdles to get over. Once you're past that, it's the art and science of compost. And this drives some people crazy. So, like, give me a recipe. And then they're like, that didn't work. Okay, and so it's not hard, but it's more of an art than it is a science. And that can drive some people nuts. And so there's different ways to manage it. Initially, when I started at the center 12 years ago, I was like, okay, if we're going to do this the right way, we're going to do it by temperature, and we have to turn it when it drops below 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and we have to turn it if it goes over 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And so I was out there with that thermometer all the time. And I was like, we have to turn it. And my farm crew was like, we're baling. Like, we're making
It's
hay.
not going to happen right now.
And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, this is important. And they're like, it's manure. All right. Like, you need to take a break. And so after a couple years of some back and forth with that, we realized, and through a lot of reading and looking at different research studies, 10 days to 2 weeks correlates to the same time as our compost having an up and down temperature spike and then a drop. And so now we put it on the calendar. And so starting the end of May or the first week of June, it's turned every 2 weeks. They pile it after calving. I get all the manure from our calving situation. So all the bedded pack that comes from there, we take it out and windrow it, and then every 2 weeks we turn it. and it's not a question. I know it's going to be turned. I can go out anytime during that week and temp it. We can check moisture. We can add moisture if we need to. We can turn it then in 2 weeks. And so the time thing works better. But I do have a lot of producers they're really curious. And so they have thermometers and they're out there texting me pictures and sending me like, is it time to turn? And they'll send me a picture. And so it's really, again, person to person, how much art and how much science you like. And so there's that part of it. But then also, is it working or isn't it? Like you do have to go check it. You do have to see, is it actually heating up? Is it not heating and why is it not? Let's troubleshoot these issues. And so there's that management of it. And then when we're done, we typically we push it up into a pile and let it cure. We let it come to ambient temperature and just I tell our producers we're just letting the microbes take a break. Just chill out for a little bit so they don't tie everything up in the soil when Ezra spreads it. And then when he goes to spread it, I say the rest is on him. Then he has to manage the spreading of it.
Mhm.
Right. Have you guys seen that there's a difference in which crops prefer the compost? Like, is there a difference in those?
What I've seen in the first year is that the longer season crops respond better because when you first apply the compost, I think some of it isn't all immediately available. And a little bit of it will get tied up with the carbon and all your residue that you have out there. So if you have an early season crop, it just doesn't have enough time to kind of come to that equilibrium to where it starts releasing nutrients.
Right.
And then in the second year, it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
And so we tell producers when I'm talking to them about using manure versus compost and working with their agronomists or their certified crop advisors is we consider manure like a slow release fertilizer product because the nitrogen is different in it. And so when we're doing all the pathogen reduction and we're reducing the volume and we're reducing parasites and all that jazz, we're also changing the form of nitrogen that's there or that's available. So it's still there, it's just less available and becomes more of a slow release. So I tell them, like, if you're spreading raw manure, that's great, really good fertilizer. A lot of our soil scientists love it. You have to tell them it's manure. Or if you're spreading compost, same. You have to know what you're spreading because then if you are going to use that as a complement to your commercial fertilizer, it really becomes important to know what they should expect from the commercial fertilizer versus the nitrogen or versus the compost versus the manure.
Okay. And then coming from like a feedlot standpoint, because it is a little more intensive, a little more of an art, do you guys have a sense of what it takes when you first come into it, your first year? Because I mean, you said you've been doing this for 12 years now, Mary? Something
Yeah,
like that?
12 years, yeah.
Okay. So, that first year though, I'd imagine there's a little bit of a breaking point where you're like, okay, this isn't quite as successful as I hoped it would be. So do you have a sense of how hard that is for a feedlot that hasn't done this before to come in and start?
Yeah, so a couple different thoughts. I remember this is one story from a producer he's an exceptional cattle feeder. And he does a great job on that end. And so he invited me to come to the very northeast part of the state. People would say there's no cows up there, and for sure there's no feedlots there. And so I was driving and driving, and we're getting close to the Canadian border. And I looked at my colleague and was like, this guy does live here, right? Because we have not seen a cow for like 20 miles. And he says there's a feedlot. And so sure enough, and this huge, big feedlot up there. And we go out and he's like, you know what? When I expanded and when I got my permit to expand and went through all the paperwork, he said, I love feeding animals. I love feeding, backgrounding and finishing. And he's like, but nobody told me what manure, like how much manure this would actually be. And he's like, and every day, Mary, every day, they make so much manure. And he's like, I've been doing this for years and I just did not know that, 500 compared to 5,000, what that looks like. He's like, it's
Right.
intense. And so there's a learning curve there, a little bit there. But then also when you're going to do compost, So we would typically clean our pens in the spring is what we encourage. Most of the time it doesn't get done till fall, right before the new ones come in. That's all right. But we typically encourage like, let's clean them in the spring, let the pen surfaces dry out and all of that. And so we're gonna haul out. We're gonna push our manure up and let it burn down during the summer, and then we're gonna haul it out in the fall after harvest. Well, with composting, you can't wait until after harvest because it's getting cold here. And so you have to
Right.
line it right away in the spring or, early summer, and then you have to turn it. And that's like, I can't just push it up and forget about it for 5 months. I have to do something with this every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so there's a learning curve there. Um, and then also I encourage folks to borrow a turner first, or see if your soil conservation districts have one. See if a friend might have one. Go talk to somebody, go to their place first. And so I had another producer on the northwest side of the state do this. He borrowed one, he used it for a summer, and he's like, I went to the chiropractor so many times because I had to turn my head and just stare at this compost. And I had told him before, I'm like, this is not the right turner for your kind of manure. And there's a
Uh,
difference. The type of manure you have and the type of turner you get are very important. Those are really important questions to ask and to really research. And he's like, I am never buying this kind of turner. He did ultimately end up buying a different one. He loves it. He's still composting. He does a lot of stuff with that. And so, again, there's a learning curve there. And it's not just, when your gearbox goes out and you want to turn, well, that's fun. Stuff breaks and you have to start over. And so, there's always going to be those kinds of things. I think it's more so just I tell folks like, we don't need to compost everything. We still really like raw manure as a
right.
fertilizer source. And if it's right for you, it's right. Where I really encourage compost use is in our crop producers. So
Mhm.
here, we tend to have you're either livestock focused or you're crop focused. We're getting more diversified again, but we've kind of gone away from that.
We've been
Generations
working
have
on
gone
that
away
here
from that.
too, trying to
Yeah.
get the mixed farms back.
Yes. And so our crop producers are like, man, we went away from livestock a long time ago for a reason. We don't want to have to manage that
No
stuff. We
more
don't want the
cows.
weeds. We don't want the extra stuff. We don't want anything like that. And so now you want to bring manure on here, put some more weeds and things that we don't have on our place. I'm like, yes. And so the best way that we can do that and encourage them to incorporate that is compost, whether they're
Mhm.
making the compost themselves or they're getting compost from the livestock producer, because consistency, weed seed reduction, volume reduction, it's just a lower stakes trial, in my opinion.
Right. And so I mentioned that we have a composting facility at our local dump, and it was an initiative brought on by a local farmer or a couple of local guys that they're actually using it on their cropland as well. How would that differ from feedlot manure? And are you guys seeing in the States that there's a little more of that dump compost available as well?
Yeah, so I say what goes in comes out, right? And it's a different, what goes in different comes out different. And so when I said we consistently feed the same thing to our animals here, so our cow-calf operation as well as our backgrounding and finishing lots, they're all on some kind of feed test. We're nutrition research. That's primarily what we do. And so they're always eating something a little different, but the majority of what they're eating is the base diet is the same. And
Mhm.
so no matter what, we test our manure every single time before we put it on. Every time, and every spring, every fall, and anytime Ezra is going to spread manure or compost once every 4 years, it's all sampled, just so we know what's in there. But generally speaking, we have a pretty good idea. If you're a producer who has fed the same type of animal in the same physiological state in a similar diet, you probably know if you test once or twice what's in there. Um, Now, if you're going to change that diet or change the animal, it's going to be different. And so we see this difference in liquid manure versus solid manure. We see the difference in a dairy cow where maybe we're doing a solid bedded pack system with those dairy animals, but those things are athletes compared to our cows who are in maintenance just hanging out, right? And so there's a huge difference in what they're getting fed and what's coming out. And same thing, we have dry lot cow system here. So our cows don't go to pasture. They're in the dry lot every single day of the year. they need a low maintenance diet.
Right.
They don't need a lot of high energy. That's going to be a lot different than what we're feeding our feedlot finisher animals. And so the diet makes a difference. So when we compare that to dump waste, and so in the States, when we're looking at compost from a landfill situation, oftentimes it is tree leaves, tree branches, wood chips, lawn, lawn clippings, stuff like that that's been composted together. So there's a couple things there. And this happens also in the, I would say, the livestock side of things too. What's on it? What's our residuals? That's a huge thing. And
Right.
it's huge as in we just need to know that there might be some residual on that so that we know what to plant the next year. That's where it becomes big. And I know it's a huge issue in the composting world. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, are we then adding like food waste to that at the dump? So that's going to add some different nutrients. Are we adding some other stuff that can be composted in there? And so everything that we're adding is going to change our output. It's going to change the nutrients that are going to be there in the end. It's not worse, it's just
Just
different.
different. And I'd
Yeah.
imagine that would change fairly drastically from year to year even, right?
I would say
Or
from,
season to season or
yeah, I would say season to season or even, load to load, right? And so, I
Mhm.
mean, it's going to be different. Unless they're really managing like this is only the yard waste row and this is
Right.
only ever the food waste row. But that's hard. That's hard to do. And so just the consistency of that is going to be very different. And so then the output's going to be different. And then you asked, are we seeing that more? I think so. I can speak just for North Dakota in general, and I do have a couple compost producers from the livestock side of things that are actually really interested and have started taking. They take yard waste, but they're also really interested in food waste and adding that and using that then on their own fields, adding that to their compost rows. And then a lot of our landfills do compost as well. They have composting operations that
Okay.
are bigger landfills.
Wow, that's amazing. And so going back to putting it on crops for those people that are running mixed farms or, might have access to some of the feedlot waste from local feedlots. Um, this might be a funny question, but Ezra, would you, because I'm guessing you get a lot of this compost and the manure for free, would you, as a producer, be willing to like? At what point would it be worth paying for compost over going and getting conventional nitrogen?
So there's a couple different people out there that have calculators that they've made that tells you basically how far you can transport it based on what your cost is. So I mean, if you're paying for it, obviously it's going to be a lot shorter distances.
Right.
But if you can get it for free, I think the one that I looked at the most, I mean, it was economical for them to haul 17, 18 miles if
Okay.
they're not paying for it.
Right. And are most people charging like from coming from the feedlots? Are they charging out for this compost? Because I mean, they're putting a lot of time and effort into it, so I could see there being a cost to that.
Yes, there's a cost to it, but they also have to look at what's their land base because they have to have a nutrient management plan.
Right, and it's a way to get
So
rid
do
of.
they have enough land to spread it on? And if
Hmm.
not, then they have to get rid of it somehow.
Right, that makes sense. That makes
And
sense.
I would say that's what we're experiencing here in North Dakota. And when I go to other states, though, I mean, they're like, we'll come up and get it, right? Like it's so valuable. They're like, we'll come and get your comp. We'll come and get your guys' manure. They have, there are consulting companies specifically for manure and manure products
Right.
in other states. And so Ezra's right in that we're not quite there yet. But I encourage it. I say like it's worth something, so don't give it away. And then
Hmm.
it's also again too like for each person. So what's valuable to me is not necessarily valuable to Ezra. And
Right.
and that goes for our producers as well. Some of them are like, yes, we absolutely have to have some kind of animal on this land, whether that's a live animal or you're bringing manure here and that's the form of animal we're getting. We absolutely want to incorporate that back. And others are like, it's just like, I'm totally out on this. I just want to know exactly what I'm putting down every time. I'm not managing anything differently. And so there's way different comfort levels too, producer to producer.
Well, and I know like out here in Canada, there has definitely been a push to have livestock on the landscape on in cropping systems. It's really tough to figure out because we have like let's be real, most of the fences have been taken out of our croplands. Like you said, there's a lot of producers that don't want cattle on their crops. They're like just there's a plethora of
Watering
different
becomes an
reasons.
issue. Yeah.
Watering becomes an issue. It's just another piece to manage. So I love the idea that we can make use of a waste product and still be putting it out there. And then you guys kind of mentioned the impact on soil health and just the organic matter and that type of thing that comes along with the compost. Is there a difference in soil type when adding it? And is that something that people need to be considering if, let's say, you're a crop producer and you're going to be putting some of this on?
Yes. So some people think, oh, we can go put this on all our saline areas and that will fix that. There is salt in manure because most of our diets do contain salt. So there's a very fine line to what you can put there, and it's a lot less than what you think. A lot of times it's, it might be 6 to 8 tons at max before you start adding to the salt level versus diluting it. So the
Yes, you
most
could make it way worse.
Yeah, the most bang for your buck in it with the composted manure and well, definitely composted manure is going to be your poorer soils, your light sandy soils, ones that are in low organic matter. Those are the ones that are going to get the biggest benefit from utilizing it.
Right, and you mentioned too that it'll like affect the acidity levels and help to neutralize that. So is there a benefit like we have a lot of guys out here that are trying liming and
Oh,
different
we've got guys
things.
here that are starting to do that big time too.
Okay, so
And like
yeah,
I said,
it's
it's not
like will
nearly as
that help it?
effective. Yeah, it will help somewhat. It's not nearly effective as lime. But
Okay.
you can reduce it, just probably not to that immediate of an extent.
hmm And what about, because let's say you're doing a winter feeding system, which some of our guys do, and you're not out on the land feeding.
Mhm.
Um, at what point does it not make sense to use that? So if we're not talking feedlot setting, we're talking, let's say, cow-calf producers, maybe a few hundred head that are feeding in bunks for the winter. Would that be worth doing something with? Or, is there a point where it's like, yeah, you know what, that's going to be way too much labor for what you're going to get out of that?
I don't think so because you're getting a lot more than just nitrogen, which a lot of guys, that's our biggest input is nitrogen fertilizer. So we've got tons of phosphorus, lots of potassium, sulfur, zinc, and all our other micros. So we can use it to cover all of those nutrient inputs, and we can read that way we're only purchasing a smaller amount of synthetic fertilizer. It's a way for us to reduce our fertilizer cost.
Right. And then make use of something you're going to be trying to get rid of in the spring
Correct.
anyway, as it is. That is great. And what are some of the questions you guys most commonly hear from producers, either on the feedlot side or on the cropping side?
I would say, what's in it? So I get those calls a lot. What's in my manure? I took a manure sample, but I don't want to send it in. What's in it? And so they get the extension lecture from me. So it's best to always send your own sample in. Because we can have such variability depending on what kind of animal they are, what we're feeding. And so I always encourage them to send it in. It's a mostly inexpensive sample, in my opinion, to know exactly what you have and what you're putting on, considering the amount of money we spend on commercial fertilizer. And so for under $100, you can see how much NPK is in there. But then also, so that's the main question that I get. Um, I was thinking earlier when Ezra started and said this, I was thinking to myself, the $1 million question. They always say, what's my organic matter worth? Oh man, I get that all the time.
Yes.
And I'm sure Ezra does too.
Hmm.
And what's your response?
It's worth a lot because so with from the plots where I'm at started out as conventional tillage,
Mm,
and we've gone to no-till and the manure once every 4 years. And so it was started in the fall of 87, and as of 2022, which is the last cycle that's complete, we've increased our organic matter in the no-till manure plots 1%. So
wow.
that's an extra inch of water holding capacity, and that's a lot more organic matter that can be mineralized, with the weather and the growing season, which also reduces our fertilizer inputs.
Right. Does that organic matter percentage change depending on the crop type?
So this would be across all the crops.
That's amazing. That's crazy. Okay, so that's more of the questions. Do you have any more for me? It's actually really interesting to hear. That's probably one of my favorite part of conferences too, is getting to hear the questions at the end.
Yeah, mine are the questions I usually get are what's it worth? How far can I haul it?
Mm, hmm.
And which crops am I going to see the most benefit out of?
Right. Right. And we kind of
So
talked about that. Like you mentioned too that you tried it on canola. And I know it's not
it
really a
did
fair setting.
fine. I just can't, my input costs and my yields don't make it very economical.
Economical.
Right. So, I mean, if you're further north where it's cooler and you have good canola yields, I would definitely use it to try and reduce my fertilizer cost because all the excess potassium and phosphorus
Phosphorus.
and zinc and sulfur that are in there, I mean, those aren't
Right.
cheap to buy.
And going with that, is it worth it? Like even that organic matter. I don't know if you guys or if anyone's put a dollar sign towards that organic matter, because that's going to be worth something too. So even if you could you could balance out, make them equivalent when it came to cost, and you had to pay
Mhm.
for your compost, right? What's that organic matter worth at the end of the
Right. So
day?
depending on whose algorithm you use, because there are several, um, depending on which ones you're looking at, it can be anywhere from like in the mid 60s to up to I think $112 an acre was the highest one I saw on the calculators.
That like
That
1% of organic matter would be worth?
yes,
Wow.
annually.
And
Wow,
I
that's
look at that
impressive.
and say, we're putting on compost once every 4 years.
Hmm.
Versus I have, our raw manure producers that are using it are putting it on the acreage closest to the barn or closest to the corral, right? Every year or every other year. Now, whether that's right or wrong, um, so I'm just thinking if we're getting 1% over this amount of time, once every 4 years with compost, what are we getting with a raw manure every year or every 2 years at a higher rate while still using that agronomically? It has to be more. And so we can see even more benefits from that.
Right. And with the raw manure, so I guess within that trucking, I'm guessing that there's a bunch of volatilization of nutrients depending on how far you're trucking it. Is there, right? I'd imagine raw manure, you'd probably lose lot more nutrients in the transportation.
That is something that we look at. So when we talked earlier about types of manure, um, we don't have if we're going to have volatilization, yes, that is going to be one of the areas. And so in a bedded pack beef situation that we have here in North Dakota, we can have potential volatilization right after they do their business out in the corral. And so that there's a little bit there we lose to the environment. And then we push it up into a pile in the spring. And so we lose a little bit right there. And then we let it set all summer and burn down. So we lose a little bit there. And then we fling it across the landscape after we've loaded it up, and we're losing just a little bit there. And so what's actually left to volatilize?
Mm,
From a bedded pack beef situation, very little. From a poultry situation, a lot. In a dairy or swine situation where they're doing solid, a lot. Where they're doing liquid, so much. But from a bedded pack beef situation, even sheep, not much. Horse, not much. We're not having a lot of volatilization. And so I like the analogy a crop producer used this past spring when I was listening to him, and then I had him come and talk to my commercial manure haulers. Sometimes we feel a little bit inadequate on the beef manure side of things because we're like, I don't know, it's like the same thing all the time. And the liquid guys have the fun equipment and they have the cool valves and they have all the, ratings and all the stuff. And we're just like, yeah, just the same equipment for how many years and we just do the thing. And so I had him go talk to them because this producer uses 4 different types of manure on their operation. One of them being a bedded pack beef manure. And he said, this is one of my favorites because it's like putting a block of wood in the stove. It just burns low and slow. It's consistent and it's there. Versus like a liquid manure is like the paper you're putting in, right? It's there, it's got nutrients, but we're using it right now. It's gone. And so there are some volatilization factors to take into consideration, but I think we're kind of on the lucky end of things when we have a bedded pack beef situation like we have.
And then how does that work for when you're applying it onto the crop throughout the season? Because I'm guessing like with liquid manure, you're going to apply it exactly when those crops need that nutrient. Whereas because it's a slow release, or even with the compost, I guess it being a slow release, does it matter when you apply those slow release manure, compost, fertilizers?
So I want to hear what Ezra has to say, and then I'll follow up with a producer story.
Okay, so depending on which crop you want the next season, that makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want more availability, you're going to want to put it on in the fall. So if you had any tie up, you kind of got that taken care of in the fall, and then when it warms up and you get moisture again in the spring, then you can start making that available again into a form that's available for the plant.
Yeah, so it definitely depends on the type of crop that we're planting. I have a producer who uses uses manure on their cropping systems. And he's like, it's great. He said, I try to get other farmers to do this as well. And so he said, the first year I tell them like, okay, we're going to spread this manure, you're going to plant your corn, and then you're going to walk away. And in July, you can't go out there and look at it for like a week. You have to go to the lake. You have to go to a fair. You got to go do something else because there will be like a week in July where you will think that we have lost our minds. It will look like it is lacking something. And you'll be really mad at me. And then you'll come back and poof, there it is. We haven't lost yield. We haven't lost anything. Everything will be great. It'll be fine. But for that week, you will wonder what I told you to do. And I'm like, yes. And we've seen that here. Ezra has shown that to producers when we've been out doing tours. They'll be like, oh, what happened to this one? And he's like, oh, that's just that's the 50 versus the 100, or that's the 100 versus the 150. And they're like, whoa, we would never. And then we go back and actually look at the yields.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, would you?
Which is so funny because in an extension, I know the push is like, get out in your field and go and look and see what's happening and know what's going on. So we're like, just walk away for a little bit.
Take a week off.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. And so as we kind of wrap up here, do you guys have any like quick tips for either feedlot producers that are considering starting up a compost facility or for crop guys that are maybe looking to put compost on their crops?
So I'm going to, a couple things. The first thing is just try it. Like, you don't have to try the whole field. You don't have to try all your acres. You won't have enough manure or compost to cover all your acres anyway. But you could try a few. You try different varieties of corn. You try different types of fertilizers. You try different fungicides. You try all the things. Just try this. Just add this into the trial mix. And the other thing is just to keep in mind what you're using. And so, last year I had a producer call from a different state. We try to help each other out, the extension folks, and so it was close to Christmas. I wanted to be baking Christmas cookies. I wanted to take the day off, but I'm like, man, this guy needs some help, and he really was pushing hard to get an answer, and so I'm like, yeah, I'll call him. And so we talked for 45 minutes, and this guy was grumpy. He was real grumpy, and because his compost wasn't turning out the way he wanted, like he wanted a specific nutrient analysis at the end, and he wasn't getting it. And so we troubleshot everything. What did you feed? What cutting were you feeding? What kind of animals did you get? Did you buy something different? Like, did they have something different happen to them as they were growing? Like, I mean, everything. Did you turn it at a different time? Did you sample it different? Did you send it to a different lab? Like, was that lab off their rocker? What happened? I mean, nothing. We couldn't debunk it at all. And I was like, man. And I asked him a handful of different times, are you sure you didn't change the diet? And he's like, no. I'm like, okay, cool. And so at the end, I finally just said, I'm not sure. I don't know. I can help you. I don't know what else to tell you. But here's some numbers of some compost producers. You should call them because they might have like an actual on the ground situation where they can say, this is what happened. And at the very end, he says, you know what? I did. I changed and I added some alfalfa to the diet this year. And I'm like, oh my, what? And he's like, well, here's the deal. I just really wanted to get the same nutrient content as the poultry guys get. And I'm like,
Oh no.
sir, the poultry guys start out with a much different format than you do. The formula they're using is completely different. The nutrient analysis in that, you're never going to get with a beef animal. Like, it doesn't
No.
matter how much you change it. Maybe we'll get close with dairy, but even then, poultry they're a machine. And he
Yeah.
was like, well, Merry Christmas. All right. And so know what you're dealing with and just like have expectations that are realistic. All right. And if your neighbor is trying something and you want to try something too, are you both using beef manure or is one of you using poultry litter? And so just know the differences there and just try it.
That's great.
One of the questions I get is, so with wheat, the spring wheat, I can get the same yield as the synthetic fertilizers, but I usually take about a 2-point hit in protein.
Yes.
So the big question is, how much nitrogen and when do I need to add it so that I don't take that protein hit?
Yes.
And we're
Right.
still working on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's still more research to be done.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah, and I guess if you're getting it for free, like I guess that would probably be the big key is producers need to know their economics, know where it's going, right? That makes sense. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for joining me on Ruminating with RealAg. It was fantastic having both of you, and I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.